Hello and welcome. I'm Aiden, your narrator for tonight. However you've arrived at this moment, tired, restless, or simply ready for somewhere else, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, I'll tell you a story called The Star's First Night. It is set in the oldest dark there is, the deep space between worlds, where light travels for centuries before it reaches any eye. Our story follows something newly born into this darkness. A star, small and uncertain, learning for the first time what it means to shine. It is a story about the particular courage of being new, about the wisdom that lives in the oldest things, and about the way each light, no matter how young, no matter how small, belongs exactly where it burns. Before we begin, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you tonight? What city, what room, what corner of the world? And what kinds of stories would you like us to bring you next? Drop a thought in the comments whenever you wake. We read everyone. If you'd like to come a little closer to what we're building here, our Patreon is open. A quiet place where early stories and small extras wait for those who want to go a little deeper. And if these nights with us have meant something to you, the simplest way to keep them coming is a subscription. It costs you nothing but a moment, and it means everything to us. Now, let yourself arrive fully. Feel the weight of your body, your legs, your back, your hands, settling into whatever is beneath you. Breathe in slowly and breathe out, releasing the shape of the day. Let each breath carry you a little further from the noise, a little closer to the quiet. There is nothing you need to do or solve or remember right now. Only this. When you're ready, let's look together into the oldest dark there is, where something new has just begun to glow, and where the whole vast universe is waiting, patient and luminous, to show it that it has always, already belonged. It is said that in the beginning of every star, there is a moment of pure surprise. Not the surprise of a person who did not expect what arrived. A different kind. The surprise of something that did not know it was going to exist, and then, all at once, did. This is how it was for the star. There was nothing, or rather, there was the kind of nothing that is not absence, but waiting. A vast cloud of cold gas and ancient dust, drifting in the dark for longer than any name could measure. Patient, unremarkable. Part of the great between space where the universe keeps its unfinished work. And then, slowly, over a span of time that has no useful comparison in the human world, the cloud began to gather itself, to lean inward, to press, gently at first, and then with increasing certainty, toward a center that had not existed before and now did. Gravity is not a dramatic force. It is a patient one. It asks and asks and asks until the answer is yes. The answer became yes. What followed happened in silence, as all great things in space happen in silence. The gas at the center compressed, the temperature rose. Not gradually, the way a room warms, abruptly, catastrophically, the way a match becomes a fire. And then the fire became something else. Something that had its own heart, its own pulse. The star did not know any of this about itself. It only knew, in the way that knowing happens without thought, that it was. That there was a heat at its center that was its own. That there was a light pushing outward from it in every direction, reaching into the dark with something like arms. That the dark received this light not as an intrusion, but as an addition. as if it had been expecting the star all along. For a long time, the star simply existed in the feeling of existing. It felt the nuclear fire at its core, slow and immense, nothing like a flame, more like a process, a conversation between atoms that produces, as a byproduct, more warmth than any single thing should contain. It felt the pressure of its own light pushing against the pressure of its own gravity, and the exquisite balance between them, and the way that balance was not a stillness, but an active negotiation, ongoing, second by second, year by year, eon by eon. It felt, for the first time, that it was breathing, not as a body breathes, as a star breathes, in the long exchange of energy and light and mass, in the rhythmic pulse of fusion and radiation, in the way something is always arriving at the surface and something is always departing. And this exchange is the heartbeat, and the heartbeat is the life. The star did not have a name for any of this. Names come later and from outside. In that first stretch of existence, the star had only the fact of itself, pure, uncompared, absolute in the way that new things are absolute before they have anything to measure themselves against. It shone. It could not help shining. Shining was not a thing it did. Shining was a thing it was. In time, the star became aware that it was not alone in the dark. This awareness arrived the way most awareness arrives in deep space, slowly, through the accumulation of signals too subtle to notice all at once. A pressure from one direction that was different from the pressure in all other directions. A quality to the dark on the far side that was different from the dark nearby. A sense, building gradually, that the space it occupied was not the whole of space, and the dark it knew was not the whole of dark. The star looked outward. It had no eyes. Seeing, for a star, is not the gathering of light into a lens. It is the sensing of forces, the receipt of other energies arriving from a distance, the recognition in the shape of what reaches you, of what must have sent it. A star perceives the universe the way the ocean floor perceives a stone dropped into water far above, not by sight, but by the ripples that arrive, eventually, after traveling a very great distance. The star perceived the universe, and the universe was large. It had known, in the abstract way one knows things one has not yet fully reckoned with, that there was a great deal of space beyond itself. But knowing and perceiving are different. The universe as it arrived at the star was not a concept. It was a presence. It had weight. It had direction. It pressed against the star from all sides simultaneously and from each side differently, and the information carried in that pressure was staggering in its scope. Far away, so far that the word far becomes meaningless and one must simply say away, simply away. There were other things shining. The star could sense them as perturbations in the great field that connected everything to everything else. Not as points of light, not as the bright dots that appear to eyes on the surface of planets. As sources, as other fires that had been burning, some of them, since before the current age of the universe. Their age was written in the character of what they broadcast. Old fires burn differently from young ones. They have learned a certainty that youth has not yet found. The star tried to take in the scale of what surrounded it. It could not. This is the thing about the universe. It is not simply very large in the way a room can be large or a country can be large. It is large in a way that defeats comprehension, even for entities far older, and more capable than a newly born star. The proper response to the universe, when you first fully encounter it, is not understanding. It is a kind of pause, a settling, the recognition that you are something that exists inside something that will not be measured. The star paused. It held its fire quietly, for a moment that lasted what a human might call years. Then, with the particular patience that very new things sometimes find, it began to look more carefully. Not at the whole was too much, but at the pieces, the near things, the other lights that were closest, that sent the clearest signals, that could be distinguished from one another, rather than absorbed as an undifferentiated flood. It began, in this way, to notice the stars. Each one was different. This surprised the star, though it could not have said why it expected otherwise. Perhaps because it only knew itself, and it was one thing, and so it had assumed that all fires would be of a similar kind. But the fires it observed around it were not the same. They were not even close to the same. They were as various as the elements from which they burned, as various as the ages they had lived, as various as the particular balance of forces that each one had negotiated with the universe on the terms of its own existence. There was a star far to what would have to be called the left, an arbitrary direction, since space has no up or down, no east or west, only the relationships between things. This star burned blue-white, not the uncertain, slightly variable white of the young star's own light, but a pure, cold, extraordinary blue-white that radiated such heat it was almost visible even at the great distance. It pulsed with a rapid rhythm. It was almost aggressive in its brightness. It had been burning for less time than some others. The young star could tell. There was an intensity in it, a hunger that the older lights had grown past. There was a star much nearer, smaller, that burned a deep amber red, old, patient. Its light arrived at the young star like something that had learned to travel slowly, to arrive gently. It did not overwhelm. It simply persisted. The young star spent a long time sensing the amber red star, trying to understand what that kind of steadiness felt like, trying to receive it as more than information. There were stars in pairs, two fires orbiting each other in a gravitational conversation that had been going on for billions of years, each one pulling on the other in a dance that was too slow to be called a dance and too purposeful to be called anything else. The young star watched their mutual orbit and felt something that might have been wonder, that two things could find each other in all the vast dark and then simply stay. There were stars so distant that what arrived was barely a whisper, old light from things that had already, perhaps, changed beyond recognition. The light still traveling long after the circumstances that created it had shifted into something else. The universe is full of this. Messages arriving after the sender has moved on. Light from dead stars. News from a past that has already become a different present by the time it reaches any receiver. The young star considered all of these lights. It held them in its awareness, or what passed for awareness in a thing that had no brain, no sensory organs, only the vast field of its own electromagnetic presence and the perturbations in that field created by everything else. It noticed the variety. It noticed the ages. It noticed that each light had a particular character that seemed to arise from some combination of its composition, its size, its age, and something else that could not be easily accounted for. some individual quality that belonged to it alone. The young star looked at these lights and thought something that was not quite a thought. It was more like a question, a frequency emitted in the shape of a question, something like, "What is mine?" The question went out into the dark, traveling at the speed of light, which is also the speed of everything that stars communicate. It would take a long time to arrive anywhere. By the time any answer came back, the young star would be older and perhaps ready to receive it. There was one star that the young star kept returning to, not the brightest, not the closest, not remarkable in any way that an outside observer would have immediately identified. But something in the character of its light drew the young star's attention, the way the grain of a particular wood draws the hand, something that wanted to be touched, wanted to be understood, that had a quality asking to be sat with rather than simply noted. The ancient star was old beyond any frame of reference the young star possessed. It had been burning since a time when the universe itself was young, when the first generations of stars were only beginning to understand what stars were for. It had seen things form that later became other things. It had burned while entire civilizations arose on small planets in distant systems, and then, in the blink of a cosmic eye, ceased. It had watched galaxies drift past each other, in collisions so slow they looked like peace. It had witnessed the birth and death of stars it had known, had felt the shock waves of their endings arrive at its own surface, and had incorporated even those into its steady burning. Its light was amber, not the pale gold of sunset, not the orange-red of embers, but a deep, pure amber that had been refined over an incomprehensible span of time into something absolutely sure of itself. It did not vary. It did not reach for greater brightness. It did not compare itself to the blue-white fire or the cool silver of the younger middle-aged stars or anything else in the neighborhood. It simply burned its amber, steady and complete, in the particular rhythm that had been its own since the moment of its ignition. The young star found, in the ancient star's light, something it had not encountered anywhere else. It was not comfort, exactly. The universe does not deal in comfort. It was something more useful than comfort. It was an example, a demonstration, offered without intention, of what it looked like to be a thing that had found its terms and then simply kept them. The ancient star was not trying to be a lesson. It was simply being what it was, as it had been for longer than the young star could imagine. But the young star received it as a lesson anyway, because that is how things are transmitted in the language of light. What you are is always teaching, whether you mean to or not. The young star oriented toward the ancient one. It is difficult to turn in space, difficult in the sense that space provides no friction, no surface, no resistance against which to push. But orientation is not the same as turning. It is more like attending, like directing the quality of one's attention. If attention is the right word for what a star does when it focuses its electromagnetic awareness on a particular source. The young star attended to the ancient one. It held the amber light in its perception and followed its rhythm and felt, beneath the rhythm, something even more fundamental, the simple fact of continuing. The ancient star had continued. Through changes it had not chosen, and upheavals it could not have predicted, and long stretches of relative quiet that might have seemed like nothing if they had not been, in fact, the substance of a very long life. It had continued because continuing was what stars did, and because its particular way of continuing was amber and steady and absolutely its own. The young star held this. But then the young star looked at itself. It compared, as all young things compare, as all new things compare, because comparison is the only tool available when you do not yet know your own standard. It looked at the ancient amber certainty and looked at its own light and saw the difference immediately and completely. Its own light flickered, not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible from far away or that indicated anything dangerous about its nuclear processes. But the flicker was there, an irregularity in the pulse, a slight variation in the intensity from moment to moment that spoke of something still being worked out. The young star's core was still settling. Its fusion processes were still finding their equilibrium. The balance between the outward pressure of its own radiation and the inward pull of its own gravity was still being negotiated, sentence by sentence, and sometimes the negotiations stumbled. The young star also noticed, for the first time, how small its light was. In the context of the vastness it had perceived, its contribution to the overall luminosity of its corner of the universe was minimal. The ancient star illuminated a region of space that dwarfed what the young star could reach. The blue-white fire far to the left sent light in all directions that traveled for distances. The young star's light had not yet approached. Even the modest amber red that burned nearby had been accumulating reach for so long that its influence extended further than the young star could calculate. Its light was young, its reach was short, its pulse was unsteady. It tried, too, to send a clearer question, a more precise frequency, something that might cut through the vast distance and arrive at the ancient star's surface with enough specificity to receive a direct answer. It did not know that this is not how the universe works. It did not know, yet, that the universe does not answer questions directly. It demonstrates. It embodies. It simply is, and lets the asking find its answer in the being. The young star would learn this. But first it had to exhaust the question, had to send it outward in every direction, had to feel it return unanswered, had to sit in the silence of an unanswered question long enough to understand that the silence was not withholding, but pointing inward, always inward, to the only place where the answer had ever been. The young star held this knowledge and did not know what to do with it. This is the particular predicament of all new things. The moment of comparison arrives before the knowledge of comparison's limits. The young star did not yet know that comparing your light to an ancient fire is like comparing a new river to the ocean it will one day reach. Not a fair measure, not a useful measure, not a measure that tells you anything true about the river's nature, or its potential, or the particular way its water moves over particular stones in a particular part of the world. It only knew that its light seemed small. It tried, briefly, to shine more brightly. This was not possible in the way it imagined. A star cannot simply decide to increase its luminosity by an act of will. Its brightness is determined by its mass and its age, and the stage it has reached in its own nuclear life. Wanting to be brighter does not make a star brighter. This is not a failure, it is a feature. Stars are what they are. Their light is their own. But the young star did not know this yet, so it dimmed slightly instead, in the way that uncertain things sometimes dim. not by choice, but by a kind of internal hesitation, a flickering that came not from the physics of its core, but from something less easily named. The young star turned its attention away from the ancient fire and looked instead into the dark between things, where there were no comparisons to make and nothing to measure itself against. It was there, in the between dark, that the ancient star's light arrived. It had travelled at the speed of light from its source to the young star, and it arrived the way ancient light always arrives, patient, unhurried, carrying within it everything that the sender was, without any of the sender's awareness that it had sent anything at all. The ancient star was not trying to reach the young star. It never tried. It only shone. But the young star received it. And in the receiving, something began to shift. The young star had been looking for words. This was the error. Or not an error exactly, because there is no error in new things, only process. But it was the limitation. The young star had been waiting for the universe to explain itself in a language it could parse, in messages it could receive and decode and act upon. It had sent out its question, "What is mine?" and had been waiting for an answer to come back in the same form, a clear signal carrying clear content. But the universe does not communicate in answers. It communicates in demonstrations. The ancient star's light was not a message. It carried no content in the sense of instructions or information. It was simply what the ancient star was, projected outward at the speed of causality into the dark, arriving at every surface it reached, and being received by each receiver in the only way possible, as itself. The young star began to understand this, slowly, the way understanding comes in space, which is to say, over a span of time that would seem, to an impatient creature, to be no progress at all. But there was progress, the kind that happens below the threshold of event, in the long accumulation of received light, in the gradual building of a model that keeps getting slightly more accurate with each new piece of information. The ancient star was showing it something, not telling, showing. There is a difference as vast as the space between stars. Telling requires a sender who knows they are telling, and a receiver who knows what to do with a message. Showing requires only that something is, and that something else is in a position to receive it. The ancient star was simply being amber, simply being steady, simply burning in its own rhythm, the one that had been its own since the universe was less than 1 billion years old. And in being that, completely and without reservation, it was showing the young star the one thing it could not learn any other way. This is what it looks like when a thing has found its own terms and kept them. The rhythm of the ancient star was not hurried, not anxious, not trying to outshine anything, or to demonstrate its worthiness, or to make its case for belonging. It burned because burning was what it was. It was amber because that was its color. It pulsed in the rhythm. It pulsed in because that was its rhythm, arrived at through billions of years of nuclear negotiation with its own interior, specific to it and no other star in the universe. There was no other star in the universe with exactly that rhythm. The young star held this thought, or its equivalent, since thoughts in stars are not thoughts in the human sense, but something more like states, sustained electromagnetic conditions that influence the character of what is emitted, and turned it slowly. No other star in the universe with exactly that rhythm. And then, No other star in the universe with exactly its own rhythm either. The young star's pulse was irregular because it was new, because its interior was still finding its way, because the equilibrium of a star takes time to settle into, and during the settling, it expresses itself as variation, as exploration, as a kind of feeling out of what the specific balance of this specific configuration of mass and heat and pressure will ultimately produce. The irregularity was not failure. The irregularity was process. The young star understood this the way light understands a prism, not because it was told, but because it passed through. There is a moment in the life of every star when it stops reaching outward for its nature and finds it instead inside. The young star reached this moment. It had been watching the Ancient One. It had been watching the blue-white fire and the amber-red and the pairs in their long dance and all the other lights in all their variety. It had been trying to find, in all of that watching, some template for what it was supposed to be, some pattern it could adopt, some frequency it could tune itself toward, some example it could follow precisely enough to become what it was watching. And then it stopped, not with drama, not with the abrupt ending of a decision made, more gradually than that, the way effort sometimes simply exhausts itself. And what remains when the effort stops is not emptiness, but the actual thing that was there all along, which the effort had been obscuring. The young star turned its attention inward, not inward in the way of introspection, which requires a mind and a narrator and a story being told to oneself, inward, in the way of a star attending to its own core, to the nuclear fire at its center, to the specific way that fire had arranged itself, to the particular signature of the fusion processes that were its own and no other stars. What it found there was not grand. It was not the blazing certainty of the blue-white fire. It was not the deep amber peace of the Ancient One. It was not any of the things it had been watching. It was smaller than any of those things, and newer, and less sure of itself, and completely specific. The young star's light was golden white, not pure gold. That was warmer, older, a thing it might become. Not pure white. That was hotter, more intense, a thing of different composition. It was between, a golden white that had a particular quality to it, a warmth without the ancient star's depth, a brightness without the blue star's cold intensity. Its own thing, arrived at not by choosing, but by being. And there was something else. At the edges of its light, in the outermost frequencies of its emission, there was a trace of violet, not visible to most instruments, a subtlety that would take very sensitive equipment to detect, and that most observers would overlook entirely. But it was there. It had always been there, the young star realized, present even in those first moments of existence when it had not yet thought to look for it. The violet edge was its own, a product of the specific mixture of elements in its core, the specific temperature at which it burned, the specific age it was at this moment in its long development. No other star in the universe had that precise golden white with that precise violet at the edges. The combination was, in the most literal sense possible, unique. The young star's pulse began to find itself. The irregularity did not disappear. It would not disappear for some time still, and even when the fusion settled into its long equilibrium, there would always be a slight variation, a living quality to the rhythm that distinguished it from anything mechanical. But the irregularity began to feel less like stumbling and more like breathing, less like error and more like character. The young star shone, not brightly, not yet, not with the reach of the Ancient One or the intensity of the blue fire, but with something that could not be borrowed or imitated or mistaken for anything else, with its own light, the only light it had and the only light it needed. The dark received it. The dark receives everything, eventually. That is the thing about the dark. It is not selective, not comparative, not judgmental. It receives each light on its own terms and holds it and allows it to travel as far as it will travel and be received by whatever will receive it. The dark did not assess the young star's light against the Ancient One's. It simply accepted it, added it to the whole, and the whole was very slightly different now, because a new light had found its terms, and having found them, had begun. Now the young star rested, not by dimming. Stars do not rest by dimming, any more than a heart rests by stopping. The young star rested by settling, by arriving, finally, in the particular state of being itself, without resistance or comparison, or reaching towards something it was not. The other lights continued around it. The blue-white fire blazed in its cold intensity. The ancient amber burned in its immovable peace. The paired stars continued their slow dance, each pulling on the other in the way that things which have found each other continue to do, indefinitely, with the same gravity they have always had. Everything continued as it had always continued. But something was different in the young star's relationship to all of it. It had stopped measuring itself against the other lights, not because it had decided to stop. Deciding suggests an act of will, and this was not that. It had stopped because the need had dissolved. When you are fully inside your own nature, comparison becomes less interesting, not irrelevant. The young star would continue to sense the other lights, to feel the perturbations they created in the great field, to receive their ancient messages and be shaped slightly by their gravity. Other stars are part of what any star is. There is no light in isolation, but each light is also, finally, itself. The young star felt the universe around it, felt the slow churn of the galaxy of which it was now a member, a vast rotating structure of hundreds of billions of stars, each one its own thing, each one contributing its particular light to a whole so large that the mind, if a star had a mind, could only gesture at it. The galaxy did not care about the size of any particular star's contribution. The galaxy was the sum of all of them. Each one was necessary in the way that every note is necessary to the particular piece of music it belongs to, not because any single note is spectacular, but because the music would not be itself without it. The young star's light traveled outward. At the speed of light, as all light travels, it reached the dust clouds at the edges of the nearby region of space and was scattered by them into new colors. It reached small rocky bodies drifting in the cold between stars and warmed their surfaces by the smallest possible fraction. It reached the edge of its own gravitational influence and continued beyond it, no longer carrying the young star's name, simply traveling as all light travels toward whatever would eventually receive it. Somewhere, eventually, in thousands of years, in tens of thousands, that light would arrive at something, would warm something, would perhaps contribute by the tiniest possible fraction to the conditions that made possible something else. The young star would never know this. Stars do not trace the paths of their own light. They only send it. It thought, in the way stars think, which is nothing like the way minds think, but is something about the other young stars it would not know for millions of years. Stars being born right now, at this moment, in clouds of gas and dust in other parts of the galaxy, each one arriving at its first moment of existing, each one looking outward at the vastness and feeling, briefly, the enormity of it, each one finding, eventually, its own frequency, all of them contributing, without knowing it, to the same whole, all of them sending their particular light in all directions, toward receivers they would never meet, arriving at surfaces in ways they could not predict, becoming part of the universe's ongoing work of simply being itself, and being, impossibly, inexhaustibly, in every moment, enough. This was enough. The young star held its fire, and its golden white light, and the violet edge that no instrument had yet noticed, and it burned with the particular rhythm it had found, not perfectly regular, not anxiously varying, but alive with the specific quality of a young thing that has only just discovered what it is, and has decided, quietly, to continue being it. The dark around it was not empty. It was full of other fires, each one its own, each one contributing its own light to the whole, each one as unrepeatable as the specific configuration of elements and forces that had produced it. The young star was one of them now, not the oldest, not the brightest, not the steadiest, but entirely itself, entirely here, entirely burning with the fire that was its own. And in the oldest dark, in the space between things where the universe does its slow and patient work, this was more than enough. This was, as it had always been, everything that was needed. The young star shone. The dark received it. And that was how the first night ended. Not with the dawn, because space has no dawn, because the stars do not wait for morning. That was how the first night ended, and became the second, and then the 10,000th, and then the long, uncounted span of an ordinary star's ordinary life, full of light, giving its light away without holding any back, burning in its own way, in its own time, in exactly the place it had always been.